Good morning, gentlemen of environmental science. We are today going to be continuing our notes, and what I want to be talking about today is the last two objectives that we have here. Compare the concept of a food chain with that of a food web, and explain why the ecosystems usually contain only a few trophic levels. So those are the kind of things that we're going to be discussing today. We're going to be jogging through this fairly quickly. Remember, we've talked about producers, gross primary productive, net primary productive, the idea of biomass, consumers, talked about the 5 different types of consumers, what the term detritus means, and then of course watch a small video on producers and consumers. Okay, so this is what we're going to talk about today. First idea that we need to discuss is the idea of a trophic level. So trophic levels indicate basically an organism's position in a sequence of energy transfer. So basically within a food chain, where an organism hits in that food chain determines its trophic level. Okay, so generally speaking, terrestrial ecosystems, so like land, anything dealing with land, involves only about 3 to 4 trophic levels. Okay, so it might start with something as little as grass, which is eaten by a deer or even a smaller organism, which is then eaten by a slightly more carnivore type organism. Then that might be eaten by one more carnivore. Okay, so in that sequence of the producer, herbivore, carnivore, carnivore, the trophic level is determined basically the first trophic level. It obviously starts with the producer. Okay. Sorry, and I forgot there. In the marine water ecosystems, there can be several more layers because of the diversity of organisms. And since there isn't plants readily available in some of the marine ecosystems, you're talking about starting with something as small as bacteria, might be getting energy from a certain source in which then that bacteria is eaten by something else. And so there's a lot more steps in the marine world rather than in the terrestrial world. Right. So now we'll kind of get into that first objective, the whole idea of a food chain versus a food web. Food chain, of course, just a single pathway. So we're just talking about, let's just say in the terrestrial world, let's say there's 4 trophic levels, 4 different organisms within the same line would be a food chain. Okay. Whereas the idea of a food web would be not only that food chain, but how that food chain might relate to or correspond with other food chains. So say, grasses at the bottom there. Grasses are eaten by how many different organisms? Okay, so each one of those organisms might start a different food chain, and each one of those organisms that eat grass, of course, could be eaten by a variety of different organisms. And as it goes up, you'll see here. So here's the idea of a food chain, of course, like I said, a straight line, no other relationships between these organisms other than algae is eaten by zooplankton. Zooplankton is, of course, eaten by fish. Okay, so this is kind of what we're talking about as far as a food chain in the Antarctic ecosystem. Again, it's a marine ecosystem, so notice how there's probably more than 4. There's more like 5 here. And so that obviously makes it fairly simple. You can see that we're starting with algae, and then we're going to move to krill, which can be eaten by cod, which are eaten by leopard seals, which then are eaten by the killer whale. Okay, so now here's the idea, and then again, that's a food chain. So here's the idea of a food web. Notice how the algae is eaten by, you can see the arrows here, is eaten by several different organisms here. It's eaten by krill, small animals and protists, and of course, small animals and protists are eaten by krill. And so you can see even right here, the relationships between even some of these what are known as the bottom of the food chains and some of these other straight lines. So here was the original straight line that we were dealing with. Okay, algae is eaten by, well, initially krill, and then it came over here, but we'll just say algae is eaten by cod, which is eaten by leopard seal, which is eaten by the killer whale. So this right down the middle here is a food chain. Now you'll notice here that the arrows, like I was saying before, go in all different kinds of directions. So that means that algae can be eaten by any one of these arrows that it's pointing to another organism, which means that each one of these is a food chain in its own right. So algae to penguins to the killer whale, well, that's a food chain right there. Okay. So in all these things, a food web is basically the relationship between each one of these organisms. Okay, so a food web is an interrelationship between different food chains, and you can see even at the top of the food web is, of course, the killer whale, which, of course, eats and is a carnivore and can eat all these different organisms, all the arrows that are pointing to it. So a food web and a food chain work very similarly. At the top of the food chain, of course, is the idea of the highest trophic level that we have, generally speaking, carnivores. Same thing with a food web. Always start at the bottom with the basic organisms, the producers, if you will, of the food web or the food chain or this ecosystem. And so then we build up from the producer to the herbivores of some sort, to the primary, to the carnivores, and then the top carnivore in the ecosystem, which of course is the killer whale. Okay. So now we'll move on to the last objective, and we'll go through this quickly. So make sure you rewind the video if you need to. But basically, when energy is transferred, so when we go back to this picture, when we're going from algae to cod to leopard seal to killer whale, unfortunately, only about 10% of the energy that is consumed at one trophic level is passed on to the next. So back in our original picture, only 10% of the energy from algae is passed on to cod, and so on and so forth. So that's why in so many cases we see fewer organisms at the top of the food chain than we do at the bottom. Not all organisms at trophic level are actually eaten. So these are several of these bullet points here are several reasons why only 10% is passed on. The first one, of course, is not all organisms in the trophic level are actually eaten. So all the available energy in that trophic level is not passed on, mainly because of that first top reason. Not all the organisms are eaten. So all that stored energy in that trophic level cannot be passed on. The second reason can be that not all the molecules of an organism are actually digested. For example, for us, the hide and the deer, the eyeballs, probably the brain, all those molecules that make up there, and then of course those things are made up of energy at some level. They, of course, are not actually consumed. So some of the energy is lost with basic structures. Okay. Prey is also use energy for cellular respiration, so the energy that they consume is obviously not used. And of course, the last one, energy is lost during the breakdown of molecules. So as the predator eats the deer or whatnot, in order to break down those molecules as it comes into its body, it has to use energy. So some energy is lost in the breakdown of those molecules and the energy release, and that's basically heat. Here's a good graphical way to look at this. So obviously we have producers down here. This is how much energy the producers will have. So the first trophic level right here, they have the majority of the energy. After that, you have herbivores. Okay, so if you want to think about this, think about the prairie. Okay, so in the prairie, you have a ton of grass. So there's a ton of energy stored in that grass. Okay, if you want to think about a large scale structure as far as herbivores, you're going to be talking about like bison. Okay, deer. There are lots of deer, lots and lots of bison used to roam the prairies, and Native Americans, like I've said before, used to travel the Great Plains following the bison herd. It was that kind of relationship. So there's tons of herbivores in this particular ecosystem. After that, you have the small carnivores. So okay, what's going to take down the bison? Okay, so on and so forth. So that might be something like a maybe like I'm trying to think like a coyote or something like that they might get after, a deer or a bison or something like that. Those types of things are out there. And then, of course, some trophic levels, there's a large carnivore that's out there that is the primary carnivore. So humans would fit, obviously, depending on how you want to think about it, somewhere in the large trophic level, or the large carnivore trophic level, or the small carnivores, even though we're kind of an omnivore in that way. So we kind of don't really fit this model perfectly, but obviously we're tending to be at the top of the food chain for most things. Okay, so here's the last thing we'll talk about. Ecosystems contain only a few trophic levels because there's a low rate of energy transfer between each level. So lower trophic levels have more organisms. Okay, there's more energy available. Okay, so the higher you go up the pyramid, the fewer organisms you see, and the reason why is because, like was said in the previous slide, only 10% of the energy gets to move on. So the amount of available energy is reduced by quite a bit. So the higher you go up, fewer organisms you see. So there, you see a ton of grass, you see a lot of deer or whatnot, but you see fewer coyotes and wolves and mountain lions and those types of organisms as you go up, because there's less available energy. Okay, the energy that they have to expend to take down the organism, to feed on the organism, to go, to hunt, all those things take energy. So the amount of available energy as you go up the ecosystem obviously goes down by quite a bit. So lower trophic levels have more organisms, higher trophic levels have, lower trophic levels have larger populations. The higher trophic levels 3 and 4, will have fewer populations. Okay, so smaller populations. All right, so that brings us to the end of energy transfer. Thank you very much, and complete the corresponding work.